you have profaned something.
To use it for something other than God's purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Ding, ding, ding.
Exactly. And so when something is taken out of its purpose, or out of its place, it has been profaned. That doesn't necessarily mean it's been made dirty or useless.
Might be, but not necessarily.
It might be, but it's not necessary to it. But it does mean that it has to be cleansed and fit for God's service again. Sanctified, blessed, whatever the law prescribed for it. We still observe that. We consecrate linens for use at the altar. Were they to be used for example, if somebody, if they were to be used for washing the dishes, if they were to be used for blowing their nose, if somebody cut themselves somehow in church and you used them for bandages, in all of those cases, they would have to be cleaned and then reconsecrated because they had been profaned. If I took all of those chalices out of the cabinet in the sacristy and we decided to use them to serve wine at a dinner party.
Apart from being the last day of her employment as the shepherd.
They would be profaned. There's a reason why we do those blessings and those consecrations, and it's to set them apart so that they are for God's use and for our use in God's house, but that's the only place that they should be used. The altar is set aside that way, and one of the rules about an altar is that I don't care how small the bug is, if there's a bug crawling across the altar, he is not to be squashed. The only sacrifice that takes place on the altar is the sacrifice of Christ. And so we can't kill anything on the altar. And if we kill anything on the altar, then the altar has to be reconsecrated.
We've sent one or two flying across the sanctuary, but we've never killed any there. So
you can blow them off. You can blow them away. What do you say?
Well, I was just going to say this is a bigger deal though than just stuff in the temple,
right?
Or things in a church. Were you going to go there?
No, go ahead. Please.
It was predicated on the idea that God as creator had ordered all things, and that in heaven, where God is attended to by the divine council, by angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, to coin a phrase, God's will reigns, and there's a place for everything, and everything needs to be in its place. Behind that is the idea that the same ought to be true on earth, but is not often for a variety of different reasons. So the temple is the place where, with sacrifices and rituals and cleansing and all of that, things get put back into the place that they belong. So the temple is the nexus, the meeting place, the conductor between heaven and earth. And that's why, as you've heard Natalie say, I've told ordinands more often than not, don't be too full of yourself as a priest, because in the final analysis, you're just a cosmic housekeeper.
Comments, questions
So,
before we go on? What they were doing, Mike was right. They were toasting. They were drinking to
yeah.
false
Right,
gods,
right.
which is even worse. They
It's-
were offering the kind of libations to false gods that were utterly denying of the reality of the one true God.
Right.
Okay, so, and if you look in Exodus and chapters, I'm trying to find here about chapter 30, it gives you instructions for the vessels that were to be made, and they were made for the tabernacle and then put in the temple at Jerusalem when the temple of Jerusalem was built. So for the people of Israel, there could be no greater profanity, short of when Antiochus Epiphanes, that Greek ruler who is never actually mentioned in Daniel but is behind the whole story, put statues of other gods in the temple itself.
Right. And his name, Epiphanius, get this, means God manifest. So he is Antiochus God manifest.
So there's, I mean, let's count the ways that that's offensive to Jews. And so the story here plays off that same kind of story. You have turned the things of God into the things of everyday use. You have profaned them in a profound way and made them unfit for the service of God. What have you got?
No pressure. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No. Well, and the thing to remember too, right, is that these court tales are told, they're basically moral tales and spiritual tales. They are told to actually shape the behavior of the people who read them. And they're being reminded that no matter what the peril, no matter how public their faithfulness to God might be, that there is a greater peril at risk. And that is by aligning yourself with that which is not God. Which, if you think about it, is in some ways a kind of lifetime existential choice, right? Are you going to live like there is a God, or are you going to live like there's some other God? One's real, the others are bogus.
Right. So he says, they praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And I want to share with you just a little bit of a passage from Isaiah. No prophet just excoriates the people who make idols of precious metals or wood or stone the way that Isaiah does. He is absolutely scathing. This is a little bit about the guy who makes the idols out of wood, because this goes on for chapters and you really don't want to hear it all. But that comes out of this Hebrew Bible by Robert Alter that I've showed you guys before and that I know you can't read, but there it is. Okay, starting in Isaiah 44, chapter 13. Or excuse me, Isaiah 44, verse 13. The carpenter stretches a line and marks the outline with a stylus. He makes it with a plane and marks the outline with a compass and makes it in the form of a man, human splendor to set in a temple, cutting down cedars for it, taking plane trees and oak. He picks the trees from the forest, he picks from the trees of the forest, plants cedar and rain makes it grow, and he turns it into fuel for man. And he takes it and he warms himself, he lights it and bakes bread and is sated. He also makes a god and worships and bows down and makes an idol and worships it. Half of it he burns in the fire, on half of it he eats meat. He roasts it, also warms himself, saying, "Hurrah, I have warmed myself. See the fire." And the rest he makes as a god, as his own idol. He worships it and bows down and prays to it and says, "Save me, for you are my God." They do not know and they do not discern, for their eyes are plastered over from seeing and their hearts from understanding. None takes to heart with no knowledge or discernment to say, "Half of it I burned with fire and also baked bread on its coals. I roasted meat and ate it, and the rest as an abhorrence I made a block of wood that I worshiped." So Isaiah's really clear that if you can burn it and cook your dinner over it and keep yourself warm, it's probably not God.
A god.
Okay. So, but he goes on for like that for several chapters. He hits them all: stone, silver, wood. They're all there before he finishes, and it's that same kind of thing. It was always not just the prohibition Israel understood that they had from God not to make idols certainly fed this. But there was also in Israel an understanding that even if they were only intended to be symbols, that by making those symbols so real that they became, in some sense, a stand-in for the God, that you were in fact worshiping something that wasn't real, that couldn't possibly be God. So the whole story in Belshazzar's feast is about a people that have given themselves over completely to every kind of lie and profanity and disgrace that they could possibly imagine.
Thoughts, questions?
Thoughts, questions, comments?
I know it doesn't say, and it's probably not the point, but we don't really know what happened to the vessels between the temple and here, right?
You mean?
No, just that they had been taken from Jerusalem, and they had them there.
And then this is something I just wanted to confirm. The lesson wasn't, if you get a chance, don't drink from these vessels, because nobody would have, and they wouldn't have even been offered a chance because it was the wives, concubines, nobles, and so on.
It was tell me what you mean by if you get a chance, don't drink from these vessels.
Well, you know how you were talking about the lessons learned? I'm assuming that there wasn't somebody who would be reading this thinking that they would have had an opportunity to drink from the vessels, but was smart enough not to.
Yeah, that's not the point.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I was just reconfirming. Okay.
Yeah, it's that they were so careless with the truth of God. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar has two dreams, and the whole thing at the end of each of those chapters with those dreams, he declares the God of Israel as powerful and all God, but he's not converted. And this is another instance where the people don't understand what they're doing, but it's not an innocent misunderstanding. It's a deliberate destruction of that which was valuable.
In a way, what you've got to remember, and I don't think we actually grapple with it much when we think about the Old Testament and we think about what it represents in terms of a spirituality. These are people who had self-consciously selected one God, so they were monotheists, and had rejected polytheism, which was, for all practical purposes, the rest of the world. So their commitment was both defining as well as always in peril, given the commitments of their neighbors. which is why the Old Testament is as unrelenting as it is about polytheism and those kinds of things. It's pretty. It's really clear. But then you've got to remember too, though, that the claim that this one God created the world really hinges on demonstrating or vindicating that claim.
So, and
I guess
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I also see it as a very deliberate act of I'm more powerful than this God, I guess, because it's like, it's not like, oops, we ran out of glasses, go grab one of those temple ones, you know. It's like,
No.
I am so powerful, I can use in a cavalier manner the things of God.
Well, and it's not only a kind of a deliberate and bald claim against the God of Israel. It's, of course, also just what people often do when they conquer other people. They demoralize them. They challenge their identity, as they did in chapter 1, and they strip them of any sense of identification with the human beings that they are. So what the English did to the Scots, you know, it's what the
English did to the Irish.
It's what the English did to the Irish. It's what the Germans did to the Poles. What the Germans did to Jews. It's a real world dynamic that ancient Israel undoubtedly experienced.
And at the time that Daniel was written, they were living under this Greek oppressor who had put statues of other gods in the temple. But they were also living with a temple that, while they built it, it was a symbol of hope. The temple of David and Solomon was a temple where God dwelt. The temple that Ezra and Nehemiah reconstruct after the Babylonian captivity is no longer a temple where God dwells. They've lost the sacred vessels. They've lost the Ark of the Covenant, which is the seat of God. They've lost everything that was inside the temple that made it holy. And even into Jesus' day, it was the hope that God would come back and dwell in the temple. If the people were pure enough, if the people were obedient enough, if they returned to God, God would return to the temple. But they were living, when this story was being told, they were living as a people set apart for a God that no longer dwelt among them. And so this story in those first, 5 verses carries a huge freight in ancient Israel. It's telling them all sorts of things about life under oppression and life without the presence of God that they'd hoped for. So that, you know, those first 5 or 6 verses read pretty clearly, but there's a whole lot going on in there. Excuse me. So then we go, and they're drinking.
Go to your overhead again?
They're drinking. Yeah, we'll go back to this, and I'll share again. They're drinking out of these cups, and it says there that suddenly, wait, if I can get this to come up. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand came out and wrote before the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing. Then did the king's countenance change, and his thoughts panicked him, and the cords of his loins locked together, went slack rather, and his knees knocked together. Okay, the hand is typically in Old Testament literature the sign of God. It's disembodied, but it looks real enough, and it writes on the wall that Belshazzar is not in any way confused about it being a real hand or it being there. And in fact, he is so frightened by the whole thing. Then did the king's countenance change, and his thoughts panicked him, that the cords of his loins went slack. In the Old Testament, the loins, the hips, are considered the seat of your strength. And so this can just mean that he just like became jelly and his knees knocked together. There are also people that say, and commentators that have said, that it was actually a far more adverse reaction than that, and he thoroughly embarrassed himself. So I don't know that it matters, except that he was completely undone by the appearance of this hand and the writing on the wall. So he does what all Nebuchadnezzar would have done, apparently what all good Babylonian kings does. The king called out loudly to bring his magicians, Chaldeans, and diviners. And the king spoke out and said to the sages of Babylon, whichever man reads this writing and tells me its meaning shall wear royal purple and have a golden collar around his neck and rule over a third of the kingdom. And then did the king's sages come in, but they could not read the writing nor make its meaning known to the king. Okay, then did King Belshazzar greatly panic, and his countenance changed, and his nobles were confounded. Okay, the words are in Aramaic. Aramaic was the, to use, I don't know what else to say. It was the lingua franca of the Mesopotamian world. So Aramaic would have been readable to all of them, but they can't read it. So the queen, probably this means his mother, although none of that bears any historical necessity. It says that the queen, because of the words of the king and his nobles, basically because of the ruckus, the queen comes into the banquet hall, and she spoke out and said, "May the king live forever." That was apparently a standard greeting for kings in Babylonia, Persia, and the ancient world, because Esther uses it all the time. Tobit uses it. The king's always going to live forever, right? Let not your thoughts panic you, nor your countenance change. Here's the grown-up coming into the meeting. She's going to square everybody away. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods resides. And in your father's days, enlightenment and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, raised him up as a master of the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans, the diviners, because exceeding spirit and knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams and explain enigmas and to untie knotty matters were found in Daniel, to whom the king gave the name Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will tell its meaning. So the queen, who obviously knew Daniel, but at least for the purposes of this story, whereas Belshazzar did not, tells him that he needs to get Daniel. Daniel will do what he did for Nebuchadnezzar. He will tell him what it all means. And Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke out and said, "You are Daniel, who is of the exiles from Judah, whom my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods resides with you, and that enlightenment and understanding and exceeding wisdom are found within you." He doesn't have it right. Neither did the queen. It's the spirit of the gods, they think, not the spirit of the one God. And the king goes on. He tells Daniel about his plight and his really wretched magicians and Chaldeans and diviners. And he said, "Now, if you can read the writing and make its meaning known to me, you shall wear royal purple, and a golden collar shall be around your neck, and over the third of the kingdom you shall rule." Then did Daniel speak out and say before the king, "Let the gift be yours, and your presents give to another. I shall read the writing and meaning I shall make known to the king. And then here's the real kind of indictment that he makes against both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And at least here, the verbal constructions, because they were in effort to follow the Hebrew so closely, are a little awkward for English, but they're probably better in your translation. I would imagine someone sorted that out. It says, you, O king, I shall make known to you, you, O king, the most high God gave kingship and greatness and honor and glory to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. And because of the greatness that he gave him, and the he here in this translation is capitalized so that you know it means God, because of the greatness that God gave him, all people, nations, and tongues were trembling and fearful before him. Whom he would will, he would slay, and whom he would will, he would let live. And whom he would will, he would raise up, and whom he would will, he would bring low. And when his heart was overweening and his spirit grew mighty in defiance, he was taken down from his royal throne and his glory was removed from him. And he was driven from mankind and his heart was leveled with the beasts. Remember, heart in this case means understanding. So his heart was leveled, or his understanding was leveled with the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. Grass, like the oxen, they fed him, and from the dew of the heavens his body was moistened, until he knew that the Most High God rules over the kingdom of man, and whom he will, he raises over it. And you, his son, Belshazzar, your heart has not been humbled, though you have known all of this. And against the Lord of the heavens you have exalted yourself, and you brought the vessels of his house before you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine in them. And you praised gods of silver and gold and bronze and wood and stone, who do not see and do not hear and do not know. And the God in whose hand is your life breath, and all your ways are his, you did not glorify. Then before him was sent the palm of a hand, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, I always mispronounce this, I'll get corrected, it's okay. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let Fred talk about that part of it.
This particular phrase it can mean a couple of different things, and it's sort of been debated back and forth, especially because of the repetition of mene, mene. What it could be translated as meaning is weighed, or numbered, weighed, divided. And it could be a reference to the fact that the Medes and the Persians defeated and divided the Babylonian Empire. Another way of understanding it too is, and this is the way it gets translated in some places, is you've been weighed and found wanting. So the image is of blowing dust off your hand. You know, you claim to be God, but you lack that kind of weight. And the notion of weight is associated with God because the Hebrew word kabod, K-A-B-O-D, meaning glory, means weight or weightiness. So, and this is a very common theme in both Daniel and in the book of Revelation, is that there are these individuals who pretend to be God, but if you actually look more closely, you find out they don't enjoy that kind of weight.
Yeah, thanks. There's also a tradition that these have to do with the values of particular coins in one reference to one another, especially because in the next verses it says, "Many God has numbered your kingship and brought it to an end. Take all, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been broken apart and given to Media and Persia." And those are Aramaic names for a coin that's worth 60 shekels, I think, a shekel itself, and then the tekel, which is a half shekel. And so it's always in diminishing of value in the kingdom. You have been counted from Nebuchadnezzar down. It's getting worse, and then you will be divided. But it ends very abruptly. Belshazzar spoke, and they clothed Daniel in royal purple and put a golden collar around his neck and proclaimed of him that he should rule over a third of the kingdom. And on that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom when he was 62 years old. So Belshazzar, we're pretty sure, actually died in battle with Cyrus, not Darius. Darius was a Persian. Cyrus was the Median king who conquered Babylon. So again, the history of the story is not the important part of the story. But that's the meaning and the value of the end of this story at the in chapter 6. You have been weighed. You have no value. You are weightless in comparison to God. And one of the things that the Old Testament doesn't actually say is that we are all weightless in comparison to God. We carry the image of God within us. And when we live into that, we have our own weight. It's not God's weight, but we have our own weight and our own value in the eyes of God. It's when we have completely turned away and not honored any of that, nor have we glorified, which it said in the previous sentence, you did not glorify the Most High God. And when we haven't glorified him, then we become weightless and we can get blown away. Questions, comments? Again, it's a story we tell children, and I do not know why.
Well, we should, but we don't tell it with much explanation.
Yeah. Bobby, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I was just thinking, I probably have heard this in the past, but, we use that expression about seeing the writing on the wall.
Uh-huh.
That's it.
This is it.
I mean, a lot of people use that and probably don't know what the origin of it is,
Probably not. But yeah, it really is a pretty telling phrase, actually.
Yeah.
It's not a compliment.
I find it interesting in the story that Daniel tells him he's put on the scales and found wanting, and yet he still clothes him in purple and gives him a gold chain. I'm not sure I would do that if somebody called me. I'd be off with their heads, more like the Queen of Hearts.
It was a risk.
So, and he did it after Daniel had already told him he didn't want this gold chain and this purple cloth.
Anything.
Right.
Yeah.
And he might have been afraid of Daniel, to and needed to try to get on his good side by doing that. But,
well, the whole business of the knocking of knees and the cords of his loins coming undone is pretty and the countenance of his face.
Graphic.
That's all really, that's a nice biblical way of saying he was scared nigh unto death.
Yes, which is
Still a better
which is-
modern English way
which
of
is
saying
another
it.
circumlocution. Any sort of further explanation of what is going on here probably comes under the heading of TMI.
So, Chrissy, what were you going to say?
I thought it was kind of interesting. Well, first of all, whenever I read that, I always think of eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You know, like choose your fate because something's going to happen to you. Which one are you going to get? But their value of gold and of riches and of treasure and desecrating the treasure of the temple. I think it's a little bit ironic that the writing on the wall had some sort of monetary altar symbolism. You know, like you have been found wanting, but let me use coinage that you will understand when I tell you how bad this is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's probably a big undercurrent in all of it. That you know, look, you're not even worth a half a shekel, which exactly. Is not very much.
It's not much. And remember, that's our coinage, not yours. So it's kind of like that's how much it's worth. It's the coinage of a conquered country.
So, but the other part of this is the part that we miss is when Daniel describes Nebuchadnezzar. He describes Nebuchadnezzar as though Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as God, whom he would will he would slay, and whom he would will he would let live, and whom he would will he would raise up, and whom he would will he would bring low. Those are God actions. And he says, okay, so what happened when his heart was overweening and his spirit grew mighty in defiance? So God drives him out to live with the asses and eat grass like an ox. Because what he's done is take over the role of God and show no humility and no obedience. And so then, you know, you, Belshazzar, you knew all this. You know, he was your father after all. You knew the whole story, and still you're doing the same thing.
And this is against the backdrop of a group of people who had been pretty unequivocally told that kings, generally speaking, were a bad idea anyway. I mean, the moral of Kings, First Kings and Second Kings basically is, okay, you can have a king, but you're not going to like it.
See, I told you so.
See, well, yeah, okay, you can have a king, and Kings 2, see, I told you so. And I don't know if you've seen Mike's comment in the chat, but he says, and to Daniel they gave the name Belshazzar, which means, look, king, I've got some bad news. I like that.
So, chapter 6, which is the one where we feed poor Daniel to the lions. So,
this is another one we tell the kids.
This is another one that we tell the children.
This probably explains why some kids have come home from Sunday school studying Daniel and have told their parents, we've been studying where people live today. My shack, your shack, and a bungalow. I think that's
so bad,
probably
dear.
that's probably
so awful. You should be
a Sunday school teacher who punted.
I'm going to send you to the lion's den on that one, Fred.
Yeah, I think so too.
I'm sorry.
You know,
I couldn't resist.
So again, this is a story. This is a story. We've got a new king, right? We've got Darius, the Persian that Daniel says is a Mede. Okay, and Darius raises up 120 satraps. Well, there were only 20 provinces in the Median Persian kingdom, but 120 is a whole lot of them. It's not a specific count. So he raised up a whole lot of satraps. A satrap is a governor. This is one of the things that struck me about this particular story is how much it's like the story of Esther. It's the same kind of conundrum where you've got an advisor of the the king, who is highly valued, who is a faithful Jew, and all the other bureaucracy of the court rises up against him and an effort to rid themselves of this pesky Jew outsider who has got the ear of the king when they don't. And so in a lot of ways, while Mordecai and Haman are only two people in the Esther story, it's the same process. It's the same story. And Esther makes a bigger deal about, like the last story that we read, having all those phrases repeated. Esther does that with satraps and viziers and all these other people. That happens less in this story, but there's still a lot of repetition. And I think that's a sign that these were oral stories, and that's the way you remember them. You remember them by the Greek chorus kinds of language that appear in them all the time.
So Hollywood's not the only ones guilty of the sequels and the rewrites.
Right. No, not at all. Where do you think they got the idea?
Right?
Yeah. But the Bible is more enduring than most Hollywood work.
Yes, but if this is as you pointed out in our first lesson, this is a narrative, not necessarily a factual accounting in historical order. They definitely have taken from a lot of other previous accounts and histories and have kind of just repackaged it, maybe for a new reader, or maybe just hey, in case you missed it in the other story, like let's revisit this concept of holding true to what you've been taught, to your faith, to God, and regardless of what evil, bad person is attacking you and your beliefs and your identity, don't be like the frog in a slow boil. Just stay true with what you're doing. Don't overlook the fact that you're slowly being systemically, chipped away at.
Right. Exactly. And their whole problem was being absorbed into the culture.
Yeah.
Are you going to be different, or are you going to be absorbed into the culture? Which I think is where Daniel comes across us too. And it's the question that Daniel asks for us in some important ways. But go ahead.
It becomes particularly poignant when, in our culture, if somebody infringes upon our rights, we at least have a process. We can beseech, a process. We have a mutually agreed upon set of social rules. It's not, and I've known people from other systems in other parts of the world, this is not the case. Like, we have very much a luxury if we feel someone is infringing upon our expression, whereas Daniel has no recourse. He is in their rules, he's in their waters, and they're hostile to him, and he's much more of a pawn than we really have an experience of being. And it's humbling when you actually see that sort of thing playing out.
Yeah,
it is. The story of that kind of faithfulness is also humbling when you kind of live day in and day out not feeling particularly challenged to do that.
So, Bobby, did you want to say something?
Well, I think it's along the same line you all are talking about, kind of what we've just gone over about, and I wrote this down so it may be close to a direct quote: living as a people set apart from a God who did not live among them. That is so bleak.
And the Psalms, that Psalm, how will we sing the Lord's song in a new land? How do we even know who we are? Is really bleak. It's very sad. And it's been, there's a huge amount of Jewish writing around that very thing. Who are we without a temple? So, and I think that it's hard for us to see that, because we haven't yet had to imagine a world where we are without access to God. It's actually one of the big differences between early Christianity and late antique Judaism, is that Christianity never had to have a single place for Christians to be able to get access to God. So, but that's a whole different conversation. Okie doke. So Daniel was one of the overseers of the kingdom, one of the 3 overseers of the kingdom. So Darius comes in, Belshazzar dies. He had given Daniel a third of the kingdom, and Daniel gets to keep it, apparently. Okay, so he's this overseer over a third of the kingdom, and one to whom the satraps would report, so that the king wasn't troubled, which I like. Sometimes I wonder who in the world gets a job to be the ruler and doesn't get to be troubled. Then was this Daniel preeminent among the overseers and the satraps, for there was an exceptional spirit in him, and the king thought to raise him up over the whole kingdom. Okay, again, we're paralleling the Joseph story too here. Then the overlords and satraps were seeking to find some pretext in Daniel in regard to the kingdom, but no pretext nor corruption could they find, for he was faithful, and no fault nor corruption was found in him. Then these men said that no pretext was found against Daniel, and we have found one against him, but we have found one against him in the law of his God. And then did the overseers and satraps come to crowd around the king, and thus said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the overseers of the kingdom, the governors and the satraps and the counselors, have resolved to issue a royal vow and enforce a binding edict for 30 days, whoever asks a petition of any god or man other than you. What's going on?
We're trying to trap him.
Right.
By buttering him up.
Well, they're trying to trap Darius, but what's the agenda with Daniel?
Well, they're trying to trap Daniel.
Uh-huh.
Good of him.
Yeah, that because the kings decided maybe instead of a third of the kingdom, he could give Daniel all of the kingdom, and then the king really wouldn't have to be troubled at all. So it would work out really well for Darius, maybe really well for Daniel, but those other 2 overseers, and then all the satraps, all of whom are looking to get ahead, that all of a sudden just really shut down the pipeline. So I think there's a huge amount of jealousy, and I think the ethnic stuff is supposed to be part of it too. So that counselors come to Darius, and they basically back him into a corner saying, look, we've all decided, so you need to do what we say, which is kind of not how Persian kingship worked, but that's how it's going to work in this story. And they say that if anybody asks a petition of any god or man other than you in the next 30 days, then you shall throw them into the lion's den. Okay. Really should be pit. Probably what they threw him into was a big hole in the ground with lions at the bottom of it. Kind of like, what's the one in Star Wars that they throw him down into? Okay, I can't remember. Ashley, help me. You're not supposed to just laugh.
Mike says rancor pit. Yeah, the rancor den. Yeah.
So you get thrown down there to get eaten, okay? So, and where did you think Star Wars came from? All those stories in Star Wars, even the little ones, come out of something that, because I know some novelists who have sworn that the only stories to tell are the variations on the ones told in the Bible.
Oh.
So now King, they're saying to Darius, you should issue the binding edict and put it down in writing that is not to be changed according to the law of Media and Persia, that shall not be transgressed. Esther has the same issue. You put it in writing, it cannot be changed. And so that's how Esther and her people end up in peril. Here it's Daniel being into peril. But because of this, because they all crowded around him, King Darius indicted the writ of the binding decree. And when Daniel knew that the writ was indicted, he went to his house, and it had windows in its upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. And 3 times daily he would fall to his knees and pray and give thanks before his God, just as he had done in time past. Now, praying 3 times a day was the custom in among Jews in the late medieval period. Or not medieval, I'm sorry, the late antique period, and when Daniel was written. We don't know when that started, but it was a custom adopted. Okay, you guys can keep going on about Star Wars if you want.
Party.
So the teacher saw that one. So no passing notes this way.
We don't care.
Yeah. So we don't know when that started in Judaism. What we do know is that Christians picked it up, and the very earliest Christian instruction manuals, which were written around 100, a little bit after, insist that Christians will pray 3 times a day. Also, in late antique Judaism, it was the custom to pray in a room with windows. Okay, so when Matthew says go into your closet and pray, doesn't really mean closet. He means your little room.
Closet is a King James English reference to a private room, not to what we call a closet.
So you're not supposed to go in there with the clothes all hanging around you in the dark and pray.
If that's good for your prayer life, go right ahead. I mean,
I'm not that picky that it has to have windows, but that was not what the custom was about. So, so that you know. And he would go into this upper chamber, and 3 times daily he would fall to his knees and pray and give thanks before his God, just as he had in times past. And then did these men come in a crowd and find Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. And they approached and said before the king, about that binding edict, king, didn't you indict a binding edict that says that no one could petition any god or man for 30 days unless he petitioned you? And the king said, well, yes. And didn't you say that he should be thrown into the lion's den? And the king said, well, yes. And the king answered, the word is right according to the law of Media and Persia, which cannot be transgressed. So they've got him. They've made him remember that this is the edict that he passed.
by the way, there's another one of those expressions, the law of Medes and Persians, meaning it's binding.
Mhm.
That's the origin of that expression too.
Yeah.
So they've got him in his mind, they've got him remembering his binding edict, and they know they've got him with it. And they said, well, Daniel, who's an exile of Judah, has not listened to your edict. And not only has he not listened to your binding edict that you indicted, 3 times daily he's praying.
Indicted or issued?
It says indicted here.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Huh.
And when the king heard the word, it was very dire for him, and he set his mind on Daniel to save him, and until sunset he was striving to rescue him. So Darius is in quite a tizzy because he doesn't know what he's going to do. They've got him on his binding edict, but they've also got Daniel, and apparently Darius places high value on Daniel. And and they come back again, lest he wiggle out, know, O king, that this is the rule of Media and Persia, that any binding edict or vow that the king issues cannot be changed. They're bucking him up a little bit, because he wants to wiggle out. And then the king said, and they brought Daniel and they threw him into the lion's den. And the king spoke out and said to Daniel, your God, whom you have always worshiped, will save you. And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his signet and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing should be changed regarding Daniel. Now, Daniel says nothing. He gets thrown into the den, and that's the last we hear of Daniel until the king comes the next morning. He'd said, you have to leave him in there overnight. And Darius goes to the palace, and he prays and he fasts through the night, which is interesting because that's what a good Jew would do in this sort of situation. He fasts through the night. No banquet table was set for him, and in a lovely turn of Hebrew phrase, it says his sleep wandered from him. Okay, which I think is a beautiful. They said that same thing of Nebuchadnezzar. His sleep wandered from him. I don't know about you, but I've had nights when my sleep does that. So then he rises with the light of the dawn, and in a rush he goes to the lion's den. And as he approached, this is verse 21, he shouted to Daniel with a sad voice. And the king spoke out and said, Daniel, servant of the living God, your God whom you worship always, can he have saved you from the lions? Then Daniel did speak with the king. O king, live forever. My God sent his messenger, and he shut the lion's mouth, and they did not harm me, because I was found innocent before him and also before you, O king. No harm have I done. Then the king was very content, and he said to bring Daniel up from the den. And Daniel was brought up from the den, and no harm was found in him, for he had trusted his God. And the king said, and they brought those men who had slandered Daniel, and they threw them into the lion's den with their children and their wives. And they had barely touched the bottom of the den when the lions overwhelmed them and crunched all their bones. Such a good story for children.
Well, you could always stop it a few verses back.
It's like,
And Tammy, if you don't listen to me,
I've learned that sometimes
I'm
children
gonna put
are
you
more
in the
literate.
pit and have your bones crunched too.
I found that sometimes children are a little more literate than I think, and I will stop stories like that only to have some rambunctious 5-year-old who knows how to read finish the story for me.
oh yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And say, hey, you're leaving parts out.
Yeah. So Darius concludes by saying that by me an edict has been issued that in all the realm of my kingdom people shall fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and endures forever, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed, and his dominion until the end. And interestingly, if you turn back to the end of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar says, the signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed with me, it pleases me to tell. His signs and wonders, how great they are, and his wonders, how powerful. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion for all generations. I'm pretty sure you can find that same language half a dozen times in the Psalms, in Isaiah, and in the prophets. So, but the stories end, they end that where, and he saves and rescues. This is the declaration of the God of Daniel. He saves and rescues and does signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, who has saved Daniel from the lions. And this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So
the kind of confession of faith ends up on the
last,
Persian ruler's
right.
lips.
So was he proclaiming him to be the one and only God, or recommending him to be worshipped among the other gods they might have had?
I think the latter, Perry. I think he's recognizing the great power and might of the God of Daniel, but I didn't see there wasn't anything in there that said, I, Darius, now worship the one true God of Israel.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So, I mean, even for a bunch of fairy tales, that would have been a little hard because they knew how Darius ended.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of verisimilitude in all at stake in all of this. I mean, it has to be realistic enough to be convincing.
So, anyway, this, just because we can't do anything without a little bit of artwork to go with it, this is a capital in a, it no longer is, but was in a Gothic cathedral. And I just think Daniel looks so bored. And I like how his stomach is sticking out of the middle of his robe. His shirt's pulled up over it. So, and the lions don't look too excited either. Everybody looks like they're just waiting for the night to be over.
No, they're waiting for the other people to be thrown in.
Yes. So this is Daniel in an Orthodox icon, dressed in an ancient Greek imagination of what a Persian looked like, with puppy dog lions. I just thought it was kind of a wonderful way of explaining the whole thing. And this little thing on the top of his head is part of a Persian hat that you see. They're called Phrygian caps, and for some reason this Phrygian headwear got associated with the Persians around the time of the 1st century, and I can't tell you why, but there you go. And this one's the last. It's a wonderful Victorian engraving. So there's all these lions and this sad, pathetic, that somewhere in the Victorian era, these stories turned to stories about children. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego become the Hebrew children thrown in the fire. And Daniel becomes a childlike adult. I don't know what the attraction was to turning them into children, because the scripture itself is pretty clear that they're grown, they're adults, but they become the Hebrew children, Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children, and so you get all these really kind of strange depictions of little children.
I like the bones in the skull in that one. That's a nice touch. That's
the previous dinner.
Yes, last night's dinner.
So questions, comments? We might even finish on time tonight.
Do you take anything away from this for your own spiritual lives? Or questions, or process it in any way?
Well, I think a story about faith is uplifting no matter what the setting. So.
And trust.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also something to be said. I mean, I know this is not quite where Daniel was heading specifically, but we have these proclamations that, for he is the living God who endures. And, we may have questions as to what sort of impact, because the story ends here.
Mm-hmm.
But then you fast forward into the New Testament, and all of a sudden these 3 astrologers show up out of nowhere that somehow are seeking a Messiah. And the question is like, well, where did they come from? How did they have how did these astrologers from the West have any sort of idea of, what's going on? It's, well,
no,
there must have been some sort of impact when we were in exile that these Gentiles have come to have some understanding of what we were seeking as well. I mean, it does kind of give us an idea of what impact might we have that we might not see.
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Good point.
for some reason, our understanding of history in the ancient world kind of stops at the Jordan River. And a lot of people will know that there was a really important Jewish school and academy in Alexandria, especially after the temple was destroyed in 110 or in 70 rather. But actually the greater center of Jewish thought and writing and stuff was between the Euphrates and the Tigris, in what they called the land between the rivers. And that was a huge population of Jews that had been there since the captivity. And it became a seat of Jewish scholarship and Jewish understanding. So these stories come out of that same area and era, but they're deep Jewish roots. I mean, by the time Jesus was alive, Jews had been in Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers, for what, 400 and some years. So it was another Jewish culture, and very much shaped by what happened in Jerusalem, but still very much its own thing, and with tremendous scholarly apparatus and effort. So, but because we don't tend to know very much about anything that far east, it's hard for us to know that. That was also a great center of Christian thought and study, and it's also something that we don't talk about. So, anyway, anything else?
Piggybacking on what Mike said, I think one of the things that I've been kind of thinking through as we've been talking through this the last several weeks is, I think sometimes when we talk about culture and the way that we are to interact with culture, we tend to be a little, I don't want to say narrow-minded, but narrow in the scope that we talk about that. You know, especially using Daniel as an example, as we're looking at just the kind of baseline stories that we have. You know, it's the, well, you need to worship this idol, and he abstains from worshiping that idol, so he kind of sets himself apart from the culture that he's in that instance. But I think it's very easy to miss all of the stuff that happens in between the lines, where, you know, there's a lot of day-to-day nuance in culture that it's not always so easy to see, and so always so easy to say, well, these are the things I need to abstain from or not. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because not all of culture is evil, even if we exist within a culture that doesn't necessarily glorify God. I think the hard thing to process is, anytime you have people coming together in groups, you're going to have some sort of expression of culture, because that's what culture is. It's groups of people, you know, having this shared identity in shared ideas and things like that. And so it's just an observation, and something that I've been trying to kind of think through as we're having these conversations is, what is that relationship that we have with culture, and how does that, you know, tie into how we interact with our culture today?
Yeah, I mean,
That's good.
That's a really good point, Kyle. And I think most of us don't have an experience of being the one on the outside. Fred's lived in Jerusalem. He certainly had it there. When we, and my only real experience of it was when we moved to Chicago. We moved to a northern suburb that's about 75% Jewish. And we were the only Gentiles on 2 or 3 blocks. And right across from the synagogue. And the community also had a very large community of Orthodox Jews. So it was one of those places where I was conscious of being a Christian in a way that I had never been conscious of being a Christian before. Even to go down and do shopping downtown, I was not like everybody else. And the very fact that on Saturdays we would do yard work because Sundays we were in church, was not a welcome development for the members of the conservative congregation that was across the street, because it was Shabbat. You know, I learned never to go to the grocery store after noon on Friday, because you could die. So there were a lot of things like that, but it was the only time I've been conscious of it. And Fred certainly, I'm sure, was in Jerusalem, that you were so conscious of not being part of what everybody else is part of.
Yeah. We would take,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that comment makes a lot of sense, really resonates with me too. But I have lived, like I lived in Iran in the mid 70s for 2 years, which totally different culture. And the thing that hit me is, of course, I knew I was going to this foreign, different culture and exciting and fun and that sort of thing. What hit me is when I came home, I didn't realize how assimilated I had actually become to the culture I lived in for 2 years. And that hit me like a brick, you know?
Yeah. There's actually a huge...
it was very...
Yeah, I was
just going to say, so it makes that difference of where the line is, you know, of assimilating into culture and living in a world where we are in the world, but not of the world, so to speak.
Yeah. There's actually literature, Kathleen, that you may have run across doing that, actually, on children who grow up in one culture and then live overseas, and then maybe go back to their native culture. They call them third culture kids. They actually construct a hybrid culture. It's not quite one or the other.
You know, in some ways, I kind of think that part of that message, I was thinking about how he was offered, you know, basically as much as a king, Daniel was. It's kind of like, you can assimilate, but can you be bought?
Well, there is that.
I like that. There you go. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it, Chrissy.
Boom.
And on that note, maybe.
Yeah, on that note, I think that was good, Chrissy. We're gonna start chapter 7 next week, and we're gonna get those beasts out of the water. 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Next week is Ash Wednesday.
Ash Wednesday.
2 weeks.
Next week we'll do Ash Wednesday, and then 2 weeks we'll do. We'll start getting those beasts out of the water, and that ought to be pretty interesting too. So
it's been great to see all of you.
It's great to see everybody tonight.
Yeah.
God bless you.
Thanks. We'll talk to you soon. I'll see some of you, I hope, on Sunday or on next Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.